Deep beneath the golden sands of Egypt, archaeologists made a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about ancient Egyptian royal life. In a sealed chamber, untouched for over 3,000 years, they found something extraordinary. Papyrus scrolls covered in hieroglyphs that had never been seen before. These weren't the usual records of battles or building projects. These were intimate accounts of life inside the most secretive part of the pharaoh's palace, the royal harem, and what they revealed about the forbidden rituals practiced within those walls would shock the world. For centuries, the royal harems of ancient Egypt have been shrouded in mystery and misconception. Most people imagine them as places of idle luxury, where beautiful women waited passively for the pharaoh's attention. But the truth, as we're about to discover, was far more complex, powerful, and fascinating than anyone could have imagined. The women of the Egyptian royal harem weren't just decorative objects. They were political players, religious practitioners, and keepers of ancient wisdom. They performed rituals so sacred and so powerful that knowledge of them was forbidden to outsiders. These ceremonies weren't just about beauty or pleasure. They were about magic, politics, and the very survival of the kingdom itself. What drove these women to participate in such mysterious practices? What secrets did they guard so carefully that they would rather die than reveal them to the outside world? And why were these rituals considered so dangerous that even speaking of them outside the harem walls was punishable by death? Tonight, we'll journey back 4,000 years to uncover the truth about these forbidden rituals. We'll meet the remarkable women who shaped the destiny of pharaohs, explore the hidden chambers where ancient magic was practiced, and reveal secrets that have been buried in the desert sands for millennia. This is a story of power, mystery, and forbidden knowledge. A story that begins in the blazing heat of the Egyptian desert, where the greatest civilization the world had ever known was built on foundations of sand, gold, and secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. To understand the forbidden rituals of the Egyptian royal harem, we must first journey back to the very beginning of pharaonic civilization. Picture the Nile Valley 5,000 years ago, when the great river was the lifeline of a growing kingdom that would eventually span from Nubia in the south to the Mediterranean in the north. The concept of the royal harem wasn't born overnight. It evolved from the practical needs of ancient Egyptian royalty and the complex religious beliefs that governed every aspect of their lives. In those early days, marriage wasn't about love or companionship. It was about politics, alliances, and the divine mandate to rule. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt weren't just kings. They were living gods, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon deity. As gods, they needed to maintain their divine power through careful ritual practices and strategic marriages. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. The women who entered the royal harem weren't passive participants in this divine drama. They became active players in maintaining the pharaoh's godlike status. The earliest harems were relatively simple affairs. A pharaoh might have a principal wife, called the Great Royal Wife, and several secondary wives who came from important noble families or foreign kingdoms. These marriages sealed alliances, brought wealth to the crown, and ensured the continuation of the royal bloodline. But as Egypt grew more powerful and more complex, so did the royal harem. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1,500 years before the birth of Christ, the royal harem had become a sophisticated institution with its own hierarchy, its own economy, and most importantly for our story, its own secret religious practices. These weren't just any religious practices. They were rituals so powerful and so sacred that they were considered state secrets. The women who performed them were sworn to absolute secrecy. Breaking that oath didn't just mean exile or imprisonment. It meant death, and not just for the woman who spoke, but often for her entire family. Why such extreme secrecy? The answer lies in the very nature of ancient Egyptian religion and politics. The pharaoh's power wasn't just military or economic. It was fundamentally spiritual. The people believed that the pharaoh maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. If that divine power was weakened or corrupted, the entire kingdom could fall into disorder. The women of the harem played a crucial role in maintaining this divine power. Through their rituals, they helped to channel the god's favor toward the pharaoh. They performed ceremonies that were believed to strengthen his connection to the divine realm. And they practiced forms of magic that were considered too dangerous for ordinary people to even witness. But who were these women? How did they come to possess such extraordinary knowledge and power? The answers to these questions reveal a side of ancient Egypt that most people never learn about. A world where women wielded influence that extended far beyond the bedroom and into the very heart of royal power. The women who entered the Egyptian royal harem came from all corners of the known world. Some were daughters of Egyptian nobles, raised from birth to understand the intricacies of court life and religious ritual. Others came from foreign kingdoms as part of diplomatic marriages, bringing with them their own magical traditions and spiritual practices. But perhaps the most intriguing were those who entered the harem, not through birth or marriage, but through their exceptional abilities. These were women who had demonstrated unusual talents in areas that the ancient Egyptians considered sacred. They might be skilled in divination, able to read the will of the gods in the flight of birds or the patterns of oil on water. They could be healers, possessing knowledge of herbs and remedies that seemed almost magical to those around them. Some had what we might call psychic abilities. They could predict the future, communicate with the spirits of the dead, or enter trance states that allowed them to serve as conduits between the human and divine worlds. In our modern world, such claims might be dismissed as superstition, but in ancient Egypt, these abilities were considered not just real, but essential to the survival of the kingdom. The selection process for these special women was as secretive as the rituals they would later perform. High-ranking priestesses would travel throughout Egypt and even to foreign lands, searching for young women who showed signs of spiritual gifts. The selection wasn't based on beauty alone, though physical attractiveness was certainly valued. More important were signs of spiritual sensitivity, intelligence, and the ability to keep secrets. Once selected, these women underwent years of training before they were allowed to participate in the most sacred rituals. They learned to read and write, skills that were rare even among noble women in ancient Egypt. They studied astronomy and mathematics, understanding that the timing of rituals was crucial to their effectiveness. They memorized hundreds of prayers, incantations, and magical formulas. Most importantly, they learned the art of ritual purification and spiritual protection. The magic they would be working with was considered extremely powerful and potentially dangerous. Without proper preparation and protection, practitioners risked not just failure, but spiritual corruption or even death. The training took place in special chambers within the harem complex, rooms that were decorated with religious symbols and equipped with the tools necessary for magical work. These included altars for burning incense, pools for ritual bathing, and collections of sacred objects that had been blessed by the high priests of various temples. But the most crucial part of their education was learning about the pharaoh himself. not just his personal preferences or political concerns, but his spiritual nature as a living God. They studied his divine genealogy, tracing his connection to the gods back through generations of rulers. They learned about his role in maintaining Ma'at and the specific ways their rituals could strengthen his divine power. This knowledge came with a terrible burden. The women of the harem possessed secrets that could potentially be used to harm the pharaoh or the kingdom. They knew the specific rituals that maintained his power, which meant they also knew how those rituals could be corrupted or reversed. This is why the oath of secrecy was so absolute, and why breaking it carried such severe penalties. The women weren't just sworn to secrecy about what they did. They were forbidden from ever speaking about what they knew, even to each other, except during the actual performance of the rituals. They developed an elaborate system of signs and symbols that allowed them to communicate about spiritual matters without speaking aloud. As these women matured in their roles, they formed a hierarchy within the harem that was based not just on their relationship to the pharaoh, but on their spiritual rank and magical abilities. At the top were the high priestesses of the harem, women who had demonstrated extraordinary spiritual gifts and who served as the leaders of the most important rituals. The women weren't just sworn to secrecy about what they did. They were forbidden from ever speaking about what they knew, even to each other, except during the actual performance of the rituals. They developed an elaborate system of signs and symbols that allowed them to communicate about spiritual matters without speaking aloud. As these women matured in their roles, they formed a hierarchy within the harem that was based not just on their relationship to the pharaoh, but on their spiritual rank and magical abilities. At the top were the high priestesses of the harem, women who had demonstrated extraordinary spiritual gifts and who served as the leaders of the most important rituals. The daily life within the royal harem was a carefully orchestrated balance of luxury, learning, and spiritual preparation. To the outside world, it might have appeared that these women lived lives of idle pleasure, spending their days in beautiful gardens, being pampered by servants, and adorning themselves with fine jewelry and cosmetics. But this surface appearance masked a reality that was far more complex and demanding. The women of the harem followed a strict daily schedule that was determined by both practical needs and religious requirements. Their day began before dawn with ritual purification. They would bathe in water that had been blessed by priests and infused with sacred herbs. This wasn't simply about cleanliness. In ancient Egyptian belief, spiritual purity was just as important as physical cleanliness. And the rituals they would perform throughout the day required them to be in a state of perfect purity. After their morning purification, the women would gather for what appeared to be a simple meal, but was actually a form of communion. The food they ate was prepared according to strict religious guidelines. Certain foods were forbidden on certain days, based on the movements of the stars and the religious calendar. Other foods were required because they were believed to enhance spiritual abilities or provide protection against malevolent forces. During these meals, the women would engage in what looked like casual conversation, but was actually a sophisticated form of spiritual education. The older, more experienced women would share knowledge with the younger ones, teaching them about the properties of different herbs, the meanings of various omens, and the proper way to conduct themselves during different types of rituals. But they had to be extremely careful about how they shared this information. Remember, they were forbidden from speaking directly about their sacred knowledge. So, they developed an elaborate code language that allowed them to communicate about spiritual matters while appearing to discuss mundane topics like cooking, gardening, or embroidery. For example, when they spoke about preparing a particular dish, they might actually be discussing the ingredients needed for a magical potion. A conversation about tending flowers could contain detailed instructions for gathering herbs under specific astrological conditions. Even discussions about weaving patterns might contain information about the proper way to arrange magical symbols. After their morning meal, the women would separate into different groups based on their specializations and their level of advancement. The novices would spend their time in intensive study, memorizing the vast body of knowledge they would need to master before they could participate in the more advanced rituals. This education was far more comprehensive than what most people, including most men, received in ancient Egypt. They studied astronomy, learning to track the movements of the stars and planets that were crucial for timing magical operations. They learned mathematics, understanding the numerical relationships that the Egyptians believed governed both the natural and supernatural worlds. They studied medicine and anatomy, gaining knowledge about the human body that was essential for healing rituals. They learned about geology and chemistry, understanding the properties of different stones, metals, and substances that were used in magical work. But perhaps most importantly, they studied psychology and human nature. The rituals they would perform weren't just about manipulating supernatural forces. They were also about understanding and influencing human behavior. A skilled practitioner needed to understand how to read people's emotions, how to inspire confidence or fear, and how to create the psychological conditions necessary for effective magic. The more advanced women would spend their mornings in practical training, actually performing simpler rituals under the supervision of the high priestesses. They would practice divination techniques, learning to read omens in everything from the behavior of sacred animals to the patterns formed by drops of oil in water. They would work with healing magic, learning to diagnose spiritual ailments and to create remedies that worked on both physical and supernatural levels. They practiced protective magic, creating amulets and talismans that could shield the pharaoh and his family from various threats. The afternoons were often devoted to what appeared to be leisure activities, but which were actually forms of spiritual discipline. They would spend time in meditation, entering trance states that allowed them to communicate with various deities and spirits. They practiced forms of movement and dance that were designed to channel spiritual energy and induce altered states of consciousness. They worked with music, learning to use specific rhythms and melodies to create the proper atmosphere for different types of rituals. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't just entertainment. It was considered a form of magic in itself, capable of influencing both human emotions and supernatural forces. Even their apparent vanity, their attention to cosmetics and jewelry, served spiritual purposes. Different colors of makeup weren't just fashion choices. They were chosen based on their magical properties and their ability to invoke the protection of specific deities. The jewelry they wore contained amulets and talismans that provided various forms of spiritual protection. Their clothing was equally significant. Different fabrics, colors, and fabrics and styles were worn for different purposes. Linen was preferred not just because it was comfortable in the Egyptian heat, but because it was considered spiritually pure. The patterns embroidered on their garments often contained magical symbols that were invisible to the untrained eye, but which provided protection or enhanced the wearer's spiritual abilities. As evening approached, the women would gather again for what appeared to be social time, but which was actually the most intense period of their spiritual work. This was when they would prepare for the night's rituals, reviewing the procedures they would follow, and purifying themselves mentally and spiritually for the sacred work ahead. The evenings were also when they would receive visitors from outside the harem. Not men, of course, but female priests from various temples, wise women from the countryside, and sometimes even foreign practitioners who had been specially invited to share their knowledge. These visits were crucial for maintaining the harem's connection to the broader spiritual community of Egypt. The women needed to stay current with developments in magical practice, changes in religious doctrine, and new techniques that were being developed in temples throughout the kingdom. But perhaps the most important evening activity was the preparation of the ritual spaces themselves. The chambers where the forbidden rituals were performed required constant maintenance and reconsecration. The women would clean these spaces with special solutions, burn purifying incense, and renew the magical protections that kept the rooms safe for their dangerous work. They would also prepare the tools and materials they would need for that night's rituals. This might involve mixing special oils, preparing herbal concoctions, or consecrating new amulets and talismans. Every item used in the rituals had to be prepared with perfect precision, because the slightest error could not only make the ritual ineffective, but could potentially unleash dangerous spiritual forces. As night fell and the time for the actual rituals approached, the atmosphere in the harem would become increasingly charged with spiritual energy. The women who would participate in that evening's ceremonies would enter a state of focused concentration, preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for the intense work ahead. But what exactly were these forbidden rituals? What made them so powerful and so dangerous that they required such elaborate preparation and such absolute secrecy? The answers to these questions reveal the true heart of the mystery that surrounded the ancient Egyptian royal harem. The forbidden rituals of the Egyptian royal harem fell into several distinct categories, each serving a different purpose in maintaining the pharaoh's divine power and protecting the kingdom from various threats. These weren't the familiar public ceremonies that took place in temples throughout Egypt. These were secret practices that had been developed specifically for use within the harem, drawing on magical traditions that were far older than the pharaonic civilization itself. The most fundamental of these rituals were the divine union ceremonies. These weren't simply about the pharaoh's relationships with his wives. They were elaborate magical operations designed to strengthen his connection to the gods and to channel divine power through his earthly form. The preparation for these rituals began days in advance. The women who would participate would enter a period of intensive purification, eating only specific foods, wearing only certain colors, and spending hours in meditation and prayer. The ritual chamber would be prepared with meticulous care, every surface cleaned with sacred water, every object blessed and consecrated according to ancient formulas. On the night of the ritual, the participating women would gather in the sacred chamber, which was decorated with symbols representing various deities and cosmic forces. The room would be filled with the smoke of specially prepared incense, creating an atmosphere that was believed to make it easier for divine beings to manifest in the physical world. The ritual itself involved elaborate ceremonies of invocation, calling upon specific gods and goddesses to bless the pharaoh and strengthen his divine nature. The women would perform sacred dances, chant ancient prayers, and work with various magical tools to create what they believed was a direct connection between the pharaoh and the divine realm. But the divine union rituals were just one type of ceremony performed in the harem. Equally important were the protection rituals, designed to shield the pharaoh and his family from various forms of harm. These threats weren't just physical dangers, like assassins or enemy armies. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, there were also spiritual threats that could be just as dangerous. Evil spirits, malevolent magic worked by enemies, curses placed by rival kingdoms, divine displeasure caused by some unknown transgression. All of these were considered real and immediate dangers that required constant vigilance and active countermeasures. The protection rituals involved creating complex magical barriers around the royal family. The women would work with various substances, herbs, oils, precious stones, metals that were believed to have protective properties. They would create amulets and talismans that were worn by the pharaoh and his children, providing them with spiritual armor against various forms of attack. Some of these protection rituals involved what we might call sympathetic magic, using symbolic representations to influence reality. The women might create wax figures representing the pharaoh's enemies, then perform rituals designed to neutralize their power or turn their hostile intentions back upon themselves. Other protection rituals worked with the power of various deities, invoking the aid of gods and goddesses who were particularly skilled at warding off danger. Isis, the great goddess of magic, was frequently called upon, as was Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess who could destroy the pharaoh's enemies. Perhaps the most dramatic were the rituals that involved direct spiritual combat. When the harem's diviners detected that magical attacks were being directed against the pharaoh, the most skilled practitioners would engage in what can only be described as psychic warfare, using their own magical abilities to battle against the hostile forces. These spiritual battles were considered extremely dangerous. The women who participated in them risked not just failure, but spiritual injury or even death. They would enter deep trance states, projecting their consciousness into what they believed were other dimensions, where they could confront the source of the magical attacks directly. The preparation for such rituals was extensive. The participants would fast for days, purifying their bodies and sharpening their spiritual senses. They would surround themselves with the most powerful protective amulets available, and they would be attended by other women whose job was to watch over their physical bodies while their spirits were engaged in battle. Another category of forbidden rituals involved divination and prophecy. The pharaoh needed to know what the future held, not just for his own safety, but for the well-being of the entire kingdom. The harem's diviners used techniques that went far beyond the familiar methods practiced in public temples. They worked with forms of scrying that involved gazing into specially prepared mirrors, pools of water, or bowls filled with oil. In these surfaces, they claimed to see visions of future events, warnings of coming dangers, and guidance about important decisions the pharaoh needed to make. They practiced forms of dream magic, entering controlled dream states where they could receive messages from the gods or explore possible futures. Some could induce prophetic dreams in others, allowing the pharaoh himself to receive divine guidance through his sleep. The most gifted diviners claimed the ability to communicate directly with the spirits of dead pharaohs, consulting with the wisdom of previous rulers about the challenges facing the current kingdom. These seances were considered among the most dangerous rituals performed in the harem, because contact with the dead was believed to expose the participants to spiritual corruption. There were also rituals focused on healing, both physical and spiritual. The pharaoh's health was considered crucial to the well-being of the entire kingdom, so maintaining his physical and spiritual condition was a constant concern. The healing rituals went far beyond herbal medicine or physical treatments. They involved working with what the Egyptians believed were the spiritual causes of illness. Disease was often attributed to spiritual imbalance, divine displeasure, or magical attack by enemies. The healing priestesses would diagnose these spiritual ailments through various forms of divination, then work to correct the underlying causes. This might involve elaborate purification ceremonies, rituals to appease offended deities, or magical operations designed to neutralize hostile magic. Some healing rituals involved what we might call energy work, with the practitioners claiming to manipulate the life force that flowed through the pharaoh's body. They would use their hands, various tools, and magical formulas to supposedly redirect this energy, removing blockages and restoring proper balance. The most powerful healing rituals were said to involve temporary possession by healing deities. The practitioner would invite a god or goddess known for healing abilities to use her body as a vehicle, allowing the divine being to work directly on the patient. But perhaps the most mysterious and dangerous of all the forbidden rituals were those involving what the ancient Egyptians called the manipulation of time itself. These were based on the belief that skilled practitioners could influence the flow of time, speeding up beneficial processes or slowing down harmful ones. These temporal rituals were considered so dangerous that only the most advanced practitioners were allowed to attempt them, and then only in the most desperate circumstances. The theory was that time was not fixed, but could be influenced by those who understood the proper techniques. A practitioner might perform rituals designed to accelerate the pharaoh's recovery from illness, compress years of wisdom into moments of insight, or slow the aging process to extend his reign. Conversely, they might work to accelerate the decay of the kingdom's enemies, or speed up the failure of hostile magic directed against Egypt. The preparation for these temporal rituals was more extensive than for any other type of ceremony. The practitioners would spend weeks in preparation, aligning themselves with specific astrological conditions and purifying themselves to an extraordinary degree. The rituals themselves involved complex mathematical calculations, precise timing based on astronomical observations, and the use of materials that were believed to exist partially outside normal time. These might include stones that had fallen from the sky, metals that had been struck by lightning, or herbs that only bloomed during eclipses. The danger in these rituals came from the belief that manipulating time could have unpredictable consequences. A practitioner who made an error might age rapidly, become trapped in time loops, or even cease to exist entirely. There were stories within the harem of women who had attempted these rituals and simply vanished, leaving no trace of their existence. All of these forbidden rituals shared certain common elements. They were performed in absolute secrecy, with only the most trusted and skilled practitioners allowed to participate. They required extensive preparation and purification, both of the participants and the ritual spaces. They involved the use of rare and exotic materials, many of which were incredibly expensive and difficult to obtain. Most importantly, they were all considered to be working with forces that were beyond the understanding of ordinary people. The women who performed these rituals weren't just following rote procedures. They were believed to be channeling powers that could reshape reality itself. But with such power came enormous responsibility and equally enormous danger. The consequences of failure weren't just disappointment or embarrassment. They could include spiritual corruption, madness, physical death, or even the destruction of the soul itself. This is why the selection and training of the harem's ritual practitioners was so rigorous, and why the secrecy surrounding their work was so absolute. They were playing with forces that could potentially destroy not just themselves, but the pharaoh, the royal family, and possibly the entire kingdom. The tools and materials used in these forbidden rituals were as carefully guarded as the knowledge of how to perform the ceremonies themselves. Many of these items were incredibly rare and valuable, worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. But their value wasn't just monetary. They were considered to possess inherent magical properties that made them essential for the work of the harem. The ritual chambers themselves were equipped with permanent fixtures that had been blessed and consecrated over generations. There were altars made from specific types of stone that were believed to channel divine energy more effectively. Some were carved from black granite, symbolizing the eternal and unchanging nature of the gods. Others were made from rose quartz or other precious stones that were associated with particular deities. The walls of these chambers were covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that weren't just decorative. They were magical formulas, protective spells, and invocations that were designed to maintain the spiritual purity of the space and to amplify the power of any rituals performed there. The floors were inlaid with complex geometric patterns that served as magical diagrams. These patterns weren't random decorations. They were based on sophisticated mathematical principles that the Egyptians believed governed the structure of reality itself. By positioning themselves and their ritual tools according to these patterns, the practitioners believed they could tap into fundamental cosmic forces. The chambers were also equipped with pools for ritual bathing and purification. These weren't simple baths. The water was specially prepared with various herbs, oils, and blessed substances. Different pools were used for different purposes, some for general purification, others for specific types of spiritual preparation. There were elaborate ventilation systems that allowed for the precise control of airflow and temperature. This wasn't just for comfort. Different rituals required different atmospheric conditions, and the ability to modify the environment was crucial for successful magical work. The lighting in these chambers could be adjusted through an ingenious system of mirrors and oil lamps. Again, this wasn't just for visibility. Different types of light were believed to be more conducive to different types of spiritual work. Some rituals required the soft, flickering light of oil lamps. Others needed the pure, steady light reflected from polished metal mirrors. Beyond these permanent fixtures, the ritual chambers contained collections of portable tools and materials that were equally important. There were countless types of incense, each with specific magical properties and uses. Some were burned to purify the atmosphere and drive away hostile spirits. Others were used to invoke particular deities or to induce specific states of consciousness in the practitioners. The harem maintained extensive collections of precious stones and metals, each chosen for its supposed magical properties. Gold was particularly prized, not just for its beauty and value, but because it was associated with the sun god Ra and was believed to be incorruptible. Silver was linked to the moon and to various goddess figures. Copper was associated with Venus and with love magic. Different stones were used for different purposes. Lapis lazuli, with its deep blue color flecked with gold, was associated with the heavens and was used in rituals involving divine communication. Parnelian was linked to protection and courage. Turquoise was believed to promote healing and spiritual insight. The harem's tool collection included countless amulets and talismans, each designed for specific purposes. Some were worn by the practitioners during rituals, to provide protection or to enhance their abilities. Others were created for the pharaoh and his family, providing them with ongoing spiritual protection. There were elaborate sets of ritual vessels made from various materials. Some were crafted from precious metals and decorated with intricate designs. Others were made from clay that had been specially prepared and blessed. Each vessel had its own purpose, some for mixing magical potions, others for burning incense, still others for containing sacred water or oil. The harem maintained collections of herbs and other organic materials that were used in various magical preparations. Many of these substances were extremely rare and expensive, imported from distant lands at great cost. Some could only be gathered under specific conditions, during eclipses, at particular phases of the moon, or from plants that grew in sacred locations. There were exotic items that most people had never seen. Fragments of meteorites, believed to carry the power of the stars. Pieces of wood from trees that had been struck by lightning, thought to contain divine energy. Sand from specific locations in the desert that were considered sacred to various deities. The harem's library contained collections of papyrus scrolls that recorded the formulas for various magical preparations. These weren't just recipes. They included detailed instructions about timing, the proper frame of mind for the preparer, and the specific prayers or incantations that needed to be recited during the preparation process. Some of the most valuable tools were those used for divination. There were special mirrors made from polished metal, their surfaces prepared according to secret formulas that were believed to enhance their ability to show visions of the future. There were bowls designed specifically for scrying, their interiors decorated with magical symbols that were supposed to focus the diviner's psychic abilities. The harem maintained collections of dice, cards, and other objects used for various forms of fortune-telling. But these weren't simple gambling devices. They were precision instruments, crafted according to specific mathematical principles and blessed through elaborate ceremonies. There were also more unusual divination tools, sets of bones from sacred animals, each bone inscribed with symbols that could be interpreted by skilled practitioners. Collections of specially prepared stones that were cast like dice to reveal divine messages. Even stranger items, like the preserved organs of prophetic animals or the crystallized tears of holy women. The most advanced practitioners had access to tools that were believed to manipulate reality itself. These included crystals that were supposed to focus and amplify psychic energy, wands made from specially prepared wood or metal that could direct magical forces, and rings or other jewelry that were believed to enhance the wearer's magical abilities. Some tools were designed for protection against the dangers inherent in magical work. There were special garments that provided spiritual armor, shields made from blessed materials that could deflect hostile magic, and emergency supplies of antidotes for various forms of spiritual poisoning. The creation and maintenance of these tools was a constant activity within the harem. Skilled craftswomen worked continuously to repair damaged items, create new tools as needed, and improve existing designs. This work was considered a form of magical practice in itself, requiring the same level of purification and spiritual preparation as the rituals the tools would be used for. The most powerful tools were often passed down through generations of practitioners, accumulating spiritual energy and effectiveness over time. These heirloom items were considered among the most precious possessions of the harem, more valuable than gold or jewels because they represented centuries of accumulated magical power. But all of these physical tools, no matter how rare or powerful, were considered secondary to the most important instrument of magical work, the practitioner herself. The women of the harem understood that true magical power came not from external objects, but from the disciplined development of their own spiritual abilities. This is why their training was so intensive and why their daily spiritual practices were so rigorous. They were working to transform themselves into living instruments of divine will, capable of channeling forces that could reshape reality itself. The tools and materials were important, but they were ultimately just aids to focus and amplify abilities that had to be developed within the practitioner herself. A skilled woman with simple tools could accomplish more than a novice surrounded by the most precious magical implements. This understanding of the primacy of internal development over external tools was part of what made the harem's magical system so sophisticated and effective. But it also made it incredibly dangerous, because practitioners who developed great power without sufficient wisdom or self-control could become threats not just to themselves, but to everyone around them. Among the most closely guarded secrets of the Egyptian royal harem were the specific techniques used to induce altered states of consciousness that were considered necessary for the most powerful magical work. These weren't simply matters of meditation or prayer. They involved sophisticated methods for fundamentally altering the practitioner's perception of reality and her ability to influence the world around her. The foundation of these techniques was breath control. The women of the harem learned elaborate breathing exercises that were far more complex than anything practiced in public temples. These weren't just relaxation techniques. They were based on the belief that breath was the link between the physical and spiritual worlds, and that by controlling their breathing in specific ways, practitioners could control their connection to divine forces. Different breathing patterns were used for different purposes. Some were designed to calm the mind and prepare for receptive states of consciousness, allowing the practitioner to receive visions or divine messages. Others were used to generate energy and power, preparing the practitioner for active magical work. The most advanced breathing techniques were said to allow practitioners to separate their consciousness from their physical bodies, traveling in spirit form to distant locations or even other dimensions. These out-of-body experiences were considered among the most dangerous aspects of harem magical practice, because practitioners who became lost or injured while in spirit form might never return to their bodies. Closely related to breath control was the use of specific postures and movements. The women learned hundreds of different positions, each designed to facilitate particular types of spiritual work. Some postures were held for hours during long rituals, requiring extraordinary physical discipline and conditioning. The movements weren't random or decorative. They were based on precise understanding of how different body positions affected the flow of what the Egyptians believed was spiritual energy through the human form. By assuming specific postures, practitioners could supposedly channel this energy in particular directions, enhancing their magical abilities or protecting themselves from spiritual harm. Some of the most powerful techniques involved ritual dance. These weren't performances for entertainment. They were precise spiritual disciplines that required years of training to master. The dances were designed to induce specific states of consciousness, invoke particular deities, or generate various types of magical energy. Different dances were performed for different purposes. Some were slow and meditative, designed to induce trance states and facilitate communication with the divine realm. Others were vigorous and ecstatic, intended to generate power and enthusiasm for active magical work. The most advanced dancers claim the ability to become temporarily possessed by various deities during their performances. In these states, They believed that gods or goddesses were using their bodies as vehicles, speaking through them and working magic through their movements. These possession states were considered both the ultimate goal of the dance training and its greatest danger. A practitioner who invited divine possession without proper preparation risked being overwhelmed by forces beyond her control, potentially resulting in madness, physical injury, or spiritual destruction. The harem also made extensive use of various substances to facilitate altered states of consciousness. These weren't recreational drugs. They were carefully prepared compounds that were considered sacred medicines, used only in religious contexts and only by properly trained practitioners. Many of these substances were derived from plants that were rare and difficult to obtain. Some grew only in specific regions of Egypt or had to be imported from distant lands. Others could only be harvested under particular conditions, during certain phases of the moon, at specific times of the year, or from plants that had been specially cultivated and blessed. The preparation of these substances was itself a form of magical practice. The plants had to be gathered by practitioners who were in a state of ritual purity. They were processed using tools that had been specially consecrated for the purpose. The entire process was accompanied by prayers, incantations, and rituals designed to enhance the spiritual potency of the final product. Different substances produced different types of altered consciousness. Some induced profound states of relaxation and receptivity, making it easier for practitioners to receive visions or divine messages. Others stimulated intense spiritual experiences, allowing practitioners to feel direct connection with various deities or to perceive normally invisible spiritual forces. The most powerful substances were said to allow practitioners to transcend normal human limitations entirely, experiencing reality from the perspective of the gods themselves. These compounds were used only in the most important rituals and only by the most experienced practitioners, because the states they induced were considered potentially overwhelming or dangerous. The use of these sacred substances was always carefully controlled and monitored. Practitioners never used them alone, but always in the presence of experienced guides who could help them navigate the altered states safely. The doses were precisely calculated based on the practitioner's experience level, physical condition, and the specific purpose of the ritual. Sound was another crucial tool for inducing altered states of consciousness. The harem maintained collections of musical instruments that were used not for entertainment, but as precise spiritual technologies. Different instruments were believed to produce vibrations that could affect human consciousness in specific ways. Drums were particularly important, with different rhythms used to induce different states of awareness. Slow, steady beats could promote deep meditative states, while faster, more complex rhythms could generate excitement and energy for active magical work. The most skilled drummers could supposedly induce possession states in dancers or lead groups of practitioners into synchronized altered consciousness. The harem's musicians also worked with various types of flutes, harps, and stringed instruments, each producing tones that were believed to resonate with different aspects of human consciousness or different divine forces. Some instruments were tuned to specific mathematical ratios that the Egyptians believed reflected fundamental cosmic harmonies. Chanting was equally important. The women learned hundreds of different vocal techniques, from whispered prayers to powerful invocations that could supposedly be heard in the divine realm. Different types of chanting were used to achieve different spiritual effects, some to induce calm and receptivity, others to generate power and authority. The most advanced vocal techniques involved what we might call overtone chanting, where practitioners learn to produce multiple tones simultaneously, creating complex harmonic effects that were believed to have profound spiritual impact. Some practitioners claimed the ability to use their voices to directly influence physical reality, healing illness, affecting the weather, or even moving objects through sound alone. All of these consciousness-altering techniques were considered extremely dangerous when used without proper training and supervision. The states of consciousness they induced were believed to make practitioners vulnerable to spiritual attack, possession by malevolent entities, or simply becoming lost in non-ordinary reality and unable to return to normal awareness. This is why the training for these techniques was so gradual and carefully supervised. Novices might spend years learning basic breathing exercises before being allowed to attempt more advanced practices. They would master simple postures before learning complex ritual dances. They would work with mild herbal preparations before being allowed access to the most powerful consciousness-altering substances. Even experienced practitioners never worked alone when using the most powerful techniques. There were always other women present who remained in ordinary consciousness, serving as anchors and guides for those who had entered altered states. These guides were trained to recognize signs of spiritual distress and to intervene if a practitioner appeared to be in danger. The ultimate goal of all these consciousness-altering techniques was not simply to experience altered states for their own sake, but to develop the ability to function effectively in multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The most accomplished practitioners claim to be able to maintain awareness of both ordinary physical reality and various spiritual dimensions at the same time, allowing them to work magic while remaining grounded and safe. This dual awareness was considered the mark of true mastery in the harem's magical system. It required not just technical skill in the various consciousness-altering techniques, but also extraordinary mental discipline and spiritual development. Practitioners who achieved this level of ability were revered within the harem and often became teachers and guides for less experienced women. But even these masters were required to follow strict safety protocols when working with the most powerful techniques. The forces they were dealing with were considered to be beyond complete human understanding, and even the most skilled practitioners could encounter situations that exceeded their abilities to control. The consciousness-altering techniques of the harem were not just tools for individual spiritual development. They were also used to create group-altered states where multiple practitioners would enter synchronized, non-ordinary consciousness for collective magical work. These group states were considered more powerful than individual practice, but also more dangerous because the practitioners were linked on spiritual levels, and problems affecting one could spread to all the others. The techniques for creating and maintaining these group states were among the most closely guarded secrets of the harem. They required extraordinary coordination and trust among the participants, as well as highly skilled leadership from the practitioners directing the group work. These collective altered states were used for the most important and powerful rituals performed in the harem. Ceremonies that were believed to affect not just the pharaoh and his immediate family, but the spiritual condition of the entire kingdom. The women who participated in these rituals understood that they were taking responsibility for the welfare of millions of people, and that any errors in their work could have catastrophic consequences. The hierarchical structure within the Egyptian royal harem was far more complex than the simple rankings based on the pharaoh's personal preferences that most people imagine. The true power structure was determined by spiritual rank, magical ability, and the level of trust that had been earned through years of faithful service and demonstrated competence in the forbidden art. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the Great Mother of the Harem, a position that was not simply ceremonial, but represented genuine spiritual authority. This woman was typically someone who had spent decades mastering the most advanced magical techniques, and who had proven her ability to guide and protect the other women under the most challenging circumstances. The Great Mother was responsible for overseeing all of the spiritual activities within the harem. She determined which rituals would be performed when, which women would participate in different ceremonies, and how the various magical resources would be allocated. Her word was absolute law within the harem walls, and even the pharaoh himself typically deferred to her judgment on matters relating to the spiritual welfare of the royal family. The selection of a new Great Mother when the previous one died or became incapacitated was a process shrouded in secrecy and mysticism. It wasn't simply a matter of seniority or political maneuvering. The position required someone who had demonstrated not just magical ability, but also the wisdom and spiritual strength necessary to bear the enormous responsibilities that came with ultimate authority over the harem's forbidden practices. The selection process involved various forms of divination and spiritual testing. Candidates would be required to demonstrate their abilities under the most challenging conditions, proving that they could maintain their composure and effectiveness even when dealing with the most dangerous spiritual forces. Below the Great Mother were the High Priestesses, women who had achieved mastery in specific areas of magical practice. There might be a High Priestess of Protection, responsible for all rituals designed to shield the royal family from harm. Another might specialize in healing magic, while a third focused on divination and prophecy. These high priestesses served as department heads within the harem's spiritual hierarchy, overseeing the training and activities of the women working in their particular specializations. They reported directly to the Great Mother and served as her advisors on matters relating to their areas of expertise. The high priestesses were also responsible for maintaining the standards of spiritual discipline within their departments. They monitored the progress of students, evaluated the effectiveness of different magical techniques, and made recommendations about which women should be advanced to higher levels of training. Below the high priestesses were various ranks of ordinary priestesses, each representing different levels of advancement and specialization. The exact titles and rankings varied over different periods of Egyptian history, but the basic structure remained consistent. Women progressed through these ranks based on their demonstrated abilities, their mastery of required knowledge, and their spiritual development. The advancement process was rigorous and could take many years. A woman might spend a decade or more as a novice before being considered ready for full priestess status. Even then, advancement to higher ranks required not just individual achievement, but also the approval of the existing leadership, and often some form of divine confirmation through divination or spiritual signs. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the novices and students, women who were still learning the basic principles of the harem's magical system. But even these beginners were far from powerless. They performed important support functions during major rituals, maintained the various tools and facilities needed for magical work, and served as assistants to the more experienced practitioners. The novices were also responsible for much of the daily maintenance that kept the harem functioning. They prepared the special foods required for spiritual work, maintained the purity of the ritual chambers, and cared for the various plants and animals that were used in magical practices. But the hierarchy wasn't just about spiritual rank. There were also practical considerations based on the women's relationships with the pharaoh and their roles in the political life of the kingdom. The great royal wife, the pharaoh's principal spouse, held a special position that combined both spiritual and political authority. The great royal wife was typically someone who had achieved high rank in the magical hierarchy before her marriage. But her position as the pharaoh's primary consort gave her additional responsibilities and powers. She served as the primary liaison between the harem and the pharaoh, communicating the results of divinations and the recommendations of the spiritual leadership. She also had special responsibilities for rituals involving the royal succession. The magic surrounding the transfer of divine power from one pharaoh to the next was considered among the most crucial and dangerous work performed by the harem, and the great royal wife typically played a central role in these ceremonies. Other wives of the pharaoh held positions that reflected both their spiritual advancement and their political importance. A woman who came from a powerful foreign kingdom might hold higher rank than her magical abilities alone would warrant, because her position was crucial for maintaining important diplomatic relationships. But political rank without spiritual competence was never sufficient for participation in the most important magical work. A woman might hold high position due to her marriage or her family connections, but if she lacked the necessary magical abilities, she would be excluded from the most powerful and dangerous rituals. This sometimes created tension within the harem, as women with high political rank but limited spiritual abilities might resent being excluded from the activities that represented the true power and purpose of the institution. Managing these tensions was one of the ongoing challenges faced by the Great Mother and her advisors. The hierarchy also included women who were not wives of the pharaoh at all, but who held positions based entirely on their spiritual abilities. These might be wise women who had been recruited from temples throughout Egypt, foreign practitioners who had been brought to the harem because of their special knowledge, or even women who had developed their abilities independently and been invited to join the harem community. Some of the most powerful women in the harem were those who had chosen to remain celibate, dedicating themselves entirely to spiritual development. These women often achieved levels of magical ability that exceeded even those of the pharaoh's wives, and they were revered within the harem as living embodiments of divine wisdom. The training and advancement system within the harem was designed to identify and develop spiritual talent regardless of its source. A woman who entered the harem as a lowly servant might eventually rise to the highest ranks if she demonstrated exceptional abilities and dedication. Conversely, a woman who entered with high political rank might find herself relegated to lesser roles if she proved unable or unwilling to develop the necessary spiritual competencies. This meritocratic aspect of the harem's hierarchy was one of its most remarkable features. In a society where most women had limited opportunities for advancement, the harem provided a path to genuine power and authority for those who possessed the necessary talents and were willing to undertake the demanding training required to develop them. But advancement within the hierarchy also carried increasing levels of responsibility and danger. The higher a woman rose in the magical hierarchy, the more dangerous the work she was expected to perform, and the greater the consequences if she failed. Many women who achieved high rank found that the burdens of their positions outweighed the benefits, leading to what we might recognize today as burnout or spiritual exhaustion. The leadership of the harem was constantly aware of these pressures and worked to provide support and protection for women who were dealing with the stress of high-level magical work. There were elaborate systems of mutual support, with more experienced practitioners mentoring and protecting those who were still developing their abilities. There were also strict rules about workload and rest periods, ensuring that even the most dedicated practitioners took time to recover from the intense spiritual work they were performing. The leadership understood that exhausted or stressed practitioners were not only less effective, but also more likely to make the kinds of errors that could have catastrophic consequences. The hierarchy within the harem was not static. Ranks and responsibilities shifted based on changing circumstances, the development of individual abilities, and the needs of the kingdom. A woman who specialized in protective magic might find her importance increasing during times of war, while those skilled in healing might become more crucial during periods of plague or illness. This flexibility was one of the strengths of the harem system, allowing it to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the continuity of knowledge and practice that was essential for its effectiveness. But it also created ongoing uncertainty and competition among the women, as they never knew when changing circumstances might affect their positions within the hierarchy. The complex web of relationships, rivalries, and alliances that resulted from this hierarchical system was one of the most challenging aspects of life within the harem. Women had to navigate not just the technical demands of magical practice, but also the intricate social and political dynamics that determined their place within the community. Yet despite these challenges, the hierarchical system of the harem was remarkably stable and effective. For over 3 millennia, it succeeded in maintaining the knowledge and practices that the Egyptians believed were essential for the survival of their civilization. The women who participated in this system understood that they were part of something far greater than themselves, guardians of secrets that had been passed down through countless generations and that would, they hoped, continue long after their own deaths. The daily ceremonies within the royal harem followed patterns that had been established over millennia, yet each ritual was adapted to meet the specific needs and circumstances of the moment. These weren't mechanical repetitions of ancient formulas, but living practices that required constant attention, skill, and spiritual sensitivity from their practitioners. The day began before dawn with the morning purification, a ceremony that prepared the entire harem community for the spiritual work ahead. This wasn't simply a matter of personal hygiene, though physical cleanliness was certainly important. The morning purification was designed to cleanse the participants spiritually, removing any negative influences they might have accumulated during sleep and aligning them with the divine forces they would be working with throughout the day. The ceremony began with ritual bathing in water that had been specially prepared the night before. This water was infused with various herbs and oils that were believed to have purifying properties, and it had been blessed through elaborate rituals performed by the most senior priestesses. Different women used different preparations depending on their rank, their specializations, and the particular work they would be doing that day. A woman who would be participating in healing rituals might bathe in water infused with herbs associated with medical goddesses. Someone preparing for divination work might use preparations that were believed to enhance psychic sensitivity. After the ritual bathing, the women would dress in garments that had been selected according to strict spiritual guidelines. The colors, fabrics, and even the way the clothing was fastened all had magical significance. Different colors were associated with different deities and different types of magical work. The timing of when particular colors could be worn was determined by complex astrological calculations. The garments themselves were more than just clothing. They were spiritual tools, decorated with embroidered symbols that provided protection and enhanced the wearer's magical abilities. Some garments contained hidden amulets sewn into the fabric, while others were woven from threads that had been specially blessed or prepared. Following the clothing ceremony, the women would gather for the dawn invocation, a group ritual that established the spiritual atmosphere for the entire day. This ceremony involved calling upon various deities to bless and protect the harem community, requesting guidance for the day's work and aligning the participants with the cosmic forces that governed their magical practices. The dawn invocation was led by the Great Mother, or one of the high priestesses, but it required the participation of the entire community. The women would arrange themselves in specific patterns within the ceremonial chamber, their positions determined by their rank, their specializations, and astrological considerations. The ritual involved elaborate chanting, with different groups of women singing different parts of complex harmonic arrangements. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was believed to create vibrations that could influence both human consciousness and spiritual forces. The patterns of sound were carefully designed to invoke specific deities and to create the proper atmosphere for magical work. Incense played a crucial role in the dawn invocation. Different types of incense were burned in specific sequences, creating layers of fragrance that were believed to attract beneficial spirits and repel harmful influences. The smoke patterns created by the burning incense were also read as omens, providing guidance about what the day might bring. After the dawn invocation, the women would separate into smaller groups for specialized morning ceremonies. Those who worked with healing magic might perform rituals designed to enhance their abilities to diagnose and treat various ailments. Practitioners of protective magic would conduct ceremonies to strengthen the spiritual barriers around the royal family. The diviners would perform morning consultations, using various techniques to determine what the day might hold and what precautions might be necessary. These consultations weren't just about predicting the future. They were also about identifying potential spiritual threats and determining what rituals might be needed to address them. Throughout the morning, there would be a constant flow of smaller ceremonies and spiritual activities. Individual women might perform personal rituals to prepare for specific tasks. Groups might conduct brief ceremonies to bless particular tools or materials. The more senior practitioners might meet to discuss the results of the previous night's work and to plan the day's activities. The midday period was typically devoted to what appeared to be rest and leisure, but which actually involved more subtle forms of spiritual work. The women would gather in the gardens of the harem complex, which weren't just decorative spaces, but were designed as outdoor temples for specific types of magical practice. Different areas of the gardens were associated with different deities and different types of spiritual work. There might be a section dedicated to Isis, planted with flowers and herbs associated with that goddess and designed for rituals involving healing and protection. Another area might be sacred to Hathor, decorated in ways that enhanced rituals involving love, beauty, and harmony. The women would move through these garden spaces in patterns that were carefully choreographed to maximize the spiritual benefits of their activities. What looked like casual strolling was actually a form of walking meditation designed to maintain and enhance the spiritual conditioning that had been established during the morning's ceremonies. The gardens also served as venues for outdoor rituals that required connection with natural forces. Some types of magical work were more effective when performed under the open sky, in direct contact with the earth and the energies of growing plants. The design of the garden spaces took this into account, providing areas that were suitable for various types of outdoor ceremonies. During the midday period, the women would also engage in what appeared to be social activities, but which served important spiritual functions. They would share meals that were prepared according to strict dietary guidelines, with different foods chosen for their supposed effects on magical abilities and spiritual development. These meals were also opportunities for the transmission of knowledge and the strengthening of community bonds. The more experienced women would share wisdom with novices, not through formal lectures, but through casual conversation that was carefully designed to convey important information while appearing to be simple social interaction. The afternoon brought more intensive spiritual activities. This was when many of the more complex rituals were performed, ceremonies that required the full attention and energy of the participants. The timing wasn't arbitrary. The ancient Egyptians believed that different times of day were more favorable for different types of magical work. Afternoon was considered an excellent time for active magic, rituals that were designed to accomplish specific goals or to influence particular situations. This might include ceremonies to protect the pharaoh during important meetings, rituals to ensure the success of military campaigns, or magical work designed to maintain the health and prosperity of the kingdom. These afternoon rituals often involved the use of the more elaborate tools and materials maintained by the harem. Complex preparations might be mixed, using rare ingredients that had been specially imported or gathered under specific conditions. Elaborate altar arrangements might be created, with every element positioned according to precise spiritual guidelines. The afternoon was also when many of the more advanced students would receive individual instruction from their teachers. So, this personal training was crucial for the development of magical abilities, because much of the knowledge could only be transmitted through direct, one-on-one contact between teacher and student. These training sessions weren't just academic exercises. They involved actual magical practice, with students attempting increasingly complex and powerful techniques under the careful supervision of their instructors. The afternoon hours were considered ideal for this type of intensive training because the students were alert and energetic, but not yet exhausted from a full day of spiritual work. As evening approached, the atmosphere within the harem would begin to shift toward the night's activities. The evening ceremonies were often the most important and powerful rituals of the day, ceremonies that required the most skilled practitioners and involved the greatest spiritual risks. The evening preparation was a crucial ceremony that readied the participants for the night's work. This involved more intensive purification than the morning ritual, because the magic performed at night was typically more powerful and therefore more dangerous than daytime activities. The women who would participate in the night's rituals would undergo elaborate cleansing ceremonies using special preparations that were believed to provide additional protection against spiritual harm. They would put on ceremonial garments that were reserved for the most important occasions, clothing that had been consecrated through elaborate rituals and which contained the most powerful protective amulets. The ritual chambers would be prepared with meticulous care, every surface cleaned and blessed, every tool positioned according to precise spiritual guidelines. The air would be filled with the smoke of powerful incenses, creating an atmosphere that was believed to facilitate communication with divine forces. As night fell, the most secret and powerful ceremonies would begin. These were the rituals that gave the harem its real power and importance, ceremonies so sacred and so dangerous that knowledge of them was restricted to only the most trusted and accomplished practitioners. The night rituals varied according to the phases of the moon, the positions of the planets, and the specific needs of the royal family and the kingdom. Some nights might be devoted to major protective ceremonies designed to shield Egypt from external threats. Other nights might focus on healing rituals, working to maintain the health of the pharaoh and his family. The most powerful night rituals were those that were believed to directly influence the fabric of reality itself. Ceremonies that could supposedly alter the course of events, change the weather, or even manipulate time itself. These rituals were performed only on the most auspicious occasions and only by the most skilled practitioners. The night ceremonies often continued until dawn, with the participants maintaining intense concentration and spiritual focus for hours at a time. This required extraordinary physical and mental conditioning, as well as the support of elaborate systems designed to sustain the practitioners through their demanding work. The conclusion of the night rituals was marked by the Dawn Blessing, a ceremony that thanked the divine forces for their assistance and properly closed the spiritual channels that had been opened during the night's work. This closing was crucial because failing to properly conclude the rituals could leave dangerous spiritual forces active, potentially causing harm to the practitioners or to the royal family they served. The daily cycle of ceremonies within the harem created a rhythm of spiritual activity that continued day after day, year after year, for centuries. Each day's work built upon the previous day's accomplishments, creating a cumulative effect that the practitioners believed was essential for maintaining the divine power of the pharaoh and the spiritual health of the kingdom. But this constant spiritual activity also created enormous pressure on the women who performed it. They were responsible for maintaining practices that they believed were literally matters of life and death for the entire civilization. The knowledge that any error or failure could have catastrophic consequences created a level of stress that was almost unimaginable. Yet the women of the harem continued their work generation after generation, driven by their faith in the importance of their mission and their dedication to preserving the ancient knowledge that had been entrusted to them. They understood that they were the guardians of secrets that were essential for the survival of everything they held dear, and they were willing to sacrifice their own comfort and safety to fulfill that sacred responsibility. The influence of the royal harem extended far beyond the palace walls, shaping the political, religious, and cultural life of ancient Egypt in ways that most people never realized. The women who lived within those secretive chambers weren't isolated from the broader world. They were actively engaged in influencing the course of events throughout the kingdom, using their unique knowledge and abilities to guide the decisions of pharaohs and to shape the destiny of one of history's greatest civilizations. The most obvious way the harem influenced the broader kingdom was through its role in royal succession. The magic surrounding the transfer of power from one pharaoh to the next was considered among the most crucial rituals performed by the harem's practitioners. These ceremonies weren't just symbolic. They were believed to be necessary for maintaining the divine mandate that legitimized pharaonic rule. When a pharaoh died, the women of the harem would perform elaborate rituals designed to ensure that his divine power was properly transferred to his successor. This wasn't automatic. It required specific magical procedures to maintain the unbroken chain of divine authority that stretched back to the beginning of Egyptian civilization. The harem's practitioners would work with the embalmers and priests responsible for the pharaoh's mummification, ensuring that the spiritual aspects of the process were properly handled. They would perform ceremonies designed to protect the deceased pharaoh's soul during its journey to the afterlife, while simultaneously working to establish the divine connection for his successor. These succession rituals often determined not just who would become the next pharaoh, but also the spiritual legitimacy of his rule. A pharaoh who had received the proper magical blessing from the harem would be seen as divinely chosen, while one who lacked this spiritual endorsement might face challenges to his authority. The harem's influence over succession gave its practitioners enormous political power, even though this power was exercised behind the scenes and was rarely acknowledged publicly. The Great Mother and the senior priestesses effectively had veto power over royal succession because they could withhold the magical blessing that was considered necessary for legitimate rule. This power was used carefully and rarely because the women of the harem understood that their influence depended on maintaining the perception that they were above political considerations. They presented themselves as servants of divine will rather than political players. But their spiritual authority gave them the ability to influence political outcomes when they believed it was necessary. The harem also influenced the broader kingdom through its role in training women who would eventually leave the palace and take positions of influence throughout Egypt. Not all women who entered the harem remained there for their entire lives. Some would be married to provincial governors or high-ranking officials, taking with them the knowledge and skills they had acquired during their time in the royal court. These women became centers of influence in their new communities, using their training to establish networks of women who practiced similar spiritual disciplines. Over time, this created a kingdom-wide network of women who shared common knowledge and who maintained informal connections to the royal harem. This network served multiple purposes. It provided the harem with sources of information about conditions throughout the kingdom, allowing the practitioners to adjust their magical work to address emerging problems or threats. It also created channels for distributing certain types of knowledge and influence throughout Egyptian society. A network was particularly important for maintaining religious and cultural continuity throughout the vast Egyptian kingdom. The women who had been trained in the harem carried with them standardized versions of various religious practices and magical techniques, helping to ensure that local variations didn't drift too far from accepted norms. The harem's influence on Egyptian religion was particularly significant. While the public temples maintained the official religious practices that were visible to the general population, the harem preserved and developed more advanced and esoteric forms of spiritual knowledge. Many innovations in Egyptian magical practice originated within the harem before being adopted by the broader religious community. The close contact between harem practitioners and the pharaoh gave them unique opportunities to experiment with new techniques and to test the effectiveness of various magical approaches. The harem also served as a repository for religious knowledge that was considered too dangerous or too sacred for general distribution. Ancient texts, magical formulas, and ritual procedures that were deemed inappropriate for public temples were preserved within the harem's secret libraries. This knowledge wasn't kept secret out of elitism or desire for power. The practitioners genuinely believed that certain types of magical knowledge could be dangerous if misused, and they saw themselves as responsible guardians of forces that could potentially harm Egyptian society if they fell into the wrong hands. The harem's economic influence was also significant, though often overlooked. The institution required enormous resources to maintain: expensive imported materials for magical work, rare ingredients for various preparations, skilled craftspeople to create and maintain ritual tools, and extensive support staff to handle the complex logistics of running such a sophisticated operation. The resources required by the harem created economic opportunities throughout the kingdom. Merchants specialized in importing the exotic materials needed for magical work. Craftspeople developed skills in creating the specialized tools and decorative objects used in the harem's rituals. Farmers and gatherers supplied the herbs, precious stones, and other natural materials that were essential for the harem's activities. The harem also controlled significant agricultural and manufacturing resources directly. The institution owned farms throughout Egypt that produced the special foods required for ritual work. It operated workshops that created textiles, jewelry, and other items according to spiritual specifications. The wealth controlled by the harem gave it significant economic leverage, which could be used to influence political and social developments throughout the kingdom. The institution could reward loyalty and punish opposition through its economic decisions, though this power was typically exercised subtly to maintain the appearance of being above worldly concerns. The harem's influence on Egyptian art and culture was profound and lasting. Many of the artistic motifs, architectural principles, and decorative techniques that we associate with ancient Egypt originated within the harem's secretive chambers before being adopted by the broader culture. The women of the harem were patrons of artists, craftspeople, and scholars, commissioning works that reflected their sophisticated understanding of symbolism, mathematics, and spiritual principles. The artistic standards developed within the harem influenced the development of Egyptian aesthetic principles more broadly. The harem also preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The women maintained extensive libraries of texts on subjects ranging from medicine and mathematics to poetry and philosophy. They supported scholars and scribes who worked to copy and preserve important manuscripts. Perhaps most importantly, the harem served as a center for the development of what we might call feminist thought in ancient Egypt. The institution demonstrated that women could achieve positions of genuine power and authority, could master complex intellectual and spiritual disciplines, and could play crucial roles in maintaining the stability of civilization itself. The example of the harem influenced attitudes toward women throughout Egyptian society, contributing to the relatively high status that women enjoyed in ancient Egypt compared to other ancient civilizations. The knowledge that there were women who possessed secret wisdom and who advised pharaohs on the most important matters of state created a general respect for women's capabilities that extended throughout Egyptian culture. But perhaps the most significant and lasting influence of the harem was its role in preserving knowledge and practices that would have been lost otherwise. When Egyptian civilization eventually declined and fell, much of the knowledge preserved in the harem was scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, influencing the development of various mystical and magical traditions that continue to this day. The women of the harem understood that they were the guardians of something precious and irreplaceable. They saw themselves not just as servants of the current pharaoh, but as links in an unbroken chain of knowledge and practice that connected them to the very foundations of human civilization. This sense of historical responsibility gave meaning and purpose to their sacrifices and justified the risks they took in their dangerous spiritual work. They knew that they were preserving something that future generations would need, even if those future generations might not understand or appreciate what had been preserved for them. The ultimate measure of the harem's influence lies not in the power it exercised during its active period, but in the knowledge it preserved and transmitted to future ages. The wisdom developed within those secret chambers continues to influence human understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the hidden forces that shape our world. Despite the elaborate secrecy that surrounded the royal harem, there were instances when the forbidden rituals were discovered by outsiders, and the consequences of these breaches were swift, severe, and often tragic. The stories of these discoveries provide insight into just how seriously the ancient Egyptians took the security of the harem's secrets and how far they were willing to go to protect them. One of the most famous cases occurred during the reign of Ramesses III around 1150 BCE, when a conspiracy formed within the harem itself threatened to expose the most sacred rituals to outside manipulation. the conspiracy wasn't primarily about magical knowledge. It was a political plot to assassinate the pharaoh and place one of his secondary wives' sons on the throne. But the conspirators made a fatal error. They attempted to use the harem's magical knowledge as part of their assassination plot, creating cursed objects and performing hostile magic designed to weaken the pharaoh and make him vulnerable to physical attack. This crossed a line that the senior practitioners of the harem could not tolerate. The magical aspects of the conspiracy were discovered when the harem's regular protective rituals detected the presence of hostile magic within the palace complex. The diviners immediately began investigating the source of this spiritual threat, using their most advanced techniques to track down the perpetrators. The investigation revealed not just the assassination plot, but also the fact that some of the conspirators had been sharing sacred knowledge with male accomplices outside the harem. This breach of the fundamental secrecy laws was considered even more serious than the assassination attempt itself. The punishment was swift and absolute. The women who had participated in the conspiracy were executed, but not before being subjected to spiritual punishments that were considered worse than death. Their names were erased from all records, their personal possessions were destroyed, and elaborate rituals were performed to ensure that their souls would be denied entry to the afterlife. The male conspirators faced equally severe consequences, but the broader implications of the case extended far beyond the immediate participants. The entire harem underwent a purification process that lasted for months, with every woman being subjected to intensive investigation to ensure that no other breaches of security had occurred. The case led to significant changes in the harem's security procedures and training programs. New oaths were developed that were considered even more binding than the previous ones. Additional layers of spiritual protection were implemented to make it more difficult for hostile magic to be worked within the palace complex. But perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated the lengths to which the Egyptian royal establishment was willing to go to protect the harem's secrets. The investigation and punishment of the conspirators consumed enormous resources and disrupted the normal functioning of the royal court for an extended period. Another famous case of discovery occurred several centuries later, during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek influence had begun to penetrate Egyptian culture more deeply. A Greek scholar who had gained access to the royal court became suspicious about the activities within the harem and began investigating what he suspected were primitive superstitions that were holding back Egyptian progress. This scholar, whose name has been deliberately erased from most Egyptian records, managed to bribe several servants and minor officials to provide him with information about the harem's activities. He was particularly interested in what he saw as the scientific aspects of the practices, believing that the Egyptians had developed advanced knowledge of chemistry, astronomy, and psychology that was being obscured by religious superstition. The scholar's investigations were discovered when he attempted to replicate some of the simpler rituals he had learned about, not understanding that even these basic procedures required extensive preparation and protection. His attempts to perform magical operations without proper training and safeguards resulted in what the Egyptian records describe as a spiritual disaster that affected not just the scholar himself, but also several innocent people in his vicinity. The magical disturbance created by the scholar's incompetent attempts at ritual work was detected immediately by the harem's monitoring systems. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of his unauthorized access to sacred knowledge and led to a complete review of the security procedures surrounding the royal court. The scholar himself was subjected to what the records describe as correction of his spiritual imbalance, a punishment that apparently left him alive, but fundamentally changed in ways that made it impossible for him to remember or communicate what he had learned. The servants and officials who had provided him with information faced more conventional punishments, including exile and, in some cases, execution. But the case had broader implications for the relationship between Egyptian and Greek culture during this period. The incident contributed to growing tensions between traditional Egyptian religious practices and the more rationalistic approaches favored by Greek intellectuals. It also led to increased restrictions on foreign access to Egyptian religious sites and practices. Perhaps the most tragic case of discovery involved a young Egyptian noblewoman who had been rejected for admission to the harem due to what the selectors deemed insufficient spiritual sensitivity. Consumed by curiosity and resentment, she spent years trying to discover the secrets that had been denied to her. This woman, known in the records only as the Seeker, used her noble status and family connections to gradually piece together fragments of information about the harem's practices. She was particularly clever in her approach, never asking direct questions, but instead gathering tiny pieces of information from various sources over many years. Eventually, she managed to assemble enough knowledge to attempt some of the simpler protective rituals. Her initial successes convinced her that she had discovered something extraordinary, and she began sharing her knowledge with a small circle of other women who had been similarly excluded from the harem. This unauthorized magical circle operated in secret for several years, gradually expanding their knowledge and attempting increasingly complex rituals. They believed they were preserving important knowledge that was being kept from the Egyptian people by an elitist religious establishment. The group's activities were discovered when one of their number attempted a healing ritual that went catastrophically wrong. The woman she was trying to help not only failed to recover from her illness, but suffered what the records describe as a corruption of her essential nature that made her condition far worse than it had been originally. The magical disturbance created by this failed healing attempt was detected by the harem's monitoring systems, leading to an investigation that uncovered the entire unauthorized network. The investigation revealed that the group had been unknowingly working with incomplete and corrupted versions of genuine harem rituals, making their practices not just ineffective, but actively dangerous. The punishments in this case were particularly severe because the unauthorized practitioners had been using their distorted knowledge to help other people, potentially spreading spiritual corruption throughout the community. Several members of the group died during the purification rituals that were deemed necessary to correct the damage they had caused. The case led to significant changes in how rejected applicants to the harem were handled. Instead of simply being dismissed, women who showed spiritual sensitivity but who were deemed unsuitable for harem training were now offered alternative forms of religious education that could channel their abilities in safer directions. These cases of discovery and their consequences reveal several important aspects of the harem's security system. First, the spiritual protections surrounding the harem were not just symbolic, but were believed to be functionally effective in detecting unauthorized magical activities. The repeated references to monitoring systems and spiritual disturbances suggest that the practitioners had developed sophisticated techniques for detecting when their knowledge was being misused. Second, the severity of the punishments reflects the genuine belief that misuse of the harem's knowledge could have catastrophic consequences extending far beyond the immediate practitioners. The authorities weren't simply protecting institutional secrets. They believed they were protecting the entire community from potentially devastating spiritual dangers. Third, the elaborate purification and correction procedures that followed these discoveries suggest that the Egyptians had developed what they believed were effective techniques for neutralizing the harmful effects of corrupted magical practices. These weren't just punitive measures, but were seen as necessary spiritual interventions. The cases also reveal the extent to which knowledge of the harem's practices had penetrated Egyptian society, despite the elaborate secrecy surrounding them. The fact that unauthorized practitioners could assemble enough information to attempt actual rituals suggests that fragments of genuine knowledge were circulating more widely than the harem's leadership might have preferred. This circulation of partial knowledge created ongoing security challenges for the harem. It wasn't enough to simply keep their practices secret. They also had to actively monitor for misuse of corrupted versions of their techniques and be prepared to intervene when such misuse was detected. The response to these security breaches also demonstrates the resources and authority that the harem could mobilize when its secrets were threatened. The investigations were thorough and extensive, involving not just the harem's own personnel, but also cooperation from various other institutions throughout the kingdom. But perhaps most significantly, these cases reveal the genuine fear that surrounded the harem's practices among those who knew something about them. The severity of the consequences for unauthorized practice served as a powerful deterrent, but it also contributed to the mystique and reputation for danger that surrounded the forbidden rituals. The knowledge that discovery meant not just death, but spiritual destruction created a level of fear that was far more effective than simple physical punishment would have been. People who might have been willing to risk their lives for valuable secrets were less willing to risk what they believed would be eternal damnation. Yet despite these severe consequences, the attempts to discover and replicate the harem's practices continued throughout Egyptian history. The allure of the forbidden knowledge was apparently strong enough to overcome even the most terrifying warnings about the consequences of unauthorized investigation. This persistent curiosity about the harem's secrets contributed to the development of various alternative magical traditions throughout Egyptian society. People who were unable or unwilling to risk attempting to replicate the actual harem practices instead developed their own magical systems, often incorporating elements that they believed were derived from the harem's knowledge. These alternative traditions were generally tolerated by the authorities as long as they didn't claim to represent genuine harem practices and didn't attempt to replicate the most dangerous or sacred rituals. This tolerance created a rich ecosystem of magical and spiritual practices throughout Egyptian society, with the harem's forbidden rituals serving as a kind of mythical ideal that inspired various forms of spiritual experimentation. The legacy of these cases of discovery and their consequences extended far beyond their immediate historical context. The stories became part of Egyptian folklore, serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of seeking forbidden knowledge and the importance of respecting spiritual boundaries. These stories also contributed to the mystique surrounding ancient Egyptian magic that persists to this day. The knowledge that there were secret practices so powerful and dangerous that their misuse could result in spiritual destruction has fascinated people throughout history and continues to influence modern perceptions of ancient Egyptian religion and magic. The cases also provide insight into the genuine beliefs and fears of ancient Egyptian society. The severity of the responses to unauthorized magical practice reflects a worldview in which spiritual forces were considered as real and dangerous as physical threats, and in which the misuse of sacred knowledge could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate practitioners. Understanding these cases helps us appreciate the context in which the harem's forbidden rituals were developed and practiced. They weren't simply exotic religious ceremonies performed in a vacuum, but were part of a complex system of beliefs and practices that the ancient Egyptians considered essential for maintaining the stability and safety of their civilization. The women who devoted their lives to mastering and preserving these practices understood that they were working with forces that could be tremendously beneficial when used correctly, but catastrophically destructive when mishandled. This knowledge gave their work a sense of urgency and importance that justified the sacrifices they made and the risks they took in their service to the pharaoh and the kingdom. As the centuries passed and Egypt's power waned, the royal harem and its forbidden rituals faced challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The decline wasn't sudden or dramatic, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over several hundred years as Egypt lost its independence, was conquered by foreign powers, and saw its ancient traditions increasingly challenged by new religions and cultures. The first serious challenges to the harem system came during the later periods of native Egyptian rule, when economic pressures and political instability made it increasingly difficult to maintain the elaborate infrastructure required for the forbidden rituals. The harem required enormous resources, expensive imported materials, skilled practitioners, elaborate facilities, and extensive support staff. As Egypt's wealth and power declined, these resources became increasingly scarce. The pharaohs of this period found themselves forced to make difficult choices about how to allocate their limited resources. Military needs became increasingly urgent as Egypt faced threats from Assyrian, Persian, and other foreign powers. The construction and maintenance of temples, palaces, and other infrastructure competed with the harem's needs for the attention and resources of the royal administration. Some pharaohs attempted to maintain the harem's activities at their previous levels despite these challenges, believing that the spiritual protection provided by the forbidden rituals was essential for Egypt's survival. Others began to reduce the scope and frequency of the harem's activities, focusing on what they considered the most essential practices, while eliminating what seemed less crucial. These reductions in the harem's activities created their own problems. The system of forbidden rituals had been developed as an integrated whole, with different ceremonies supporting and reinforcing each other. When parts of the system were eliminated or reduced, the effectiveness of the remaining practices was compromised. The women of the harem understood these connections better than anyone, and they warned repeatedly about the dangers of partial implementation of their traditional practices. But their warnings often fell on deaf ears as pragmatic political considerations took precedence over spiritual concerns. The situation became even more challenging when Egypt was conquered by the Persians in 525 BCE. The Persian rulers were generally tolerant of local religious practices, but they had little understanding of or interest in the complex spiritual theories that underlay the harem's activities. From the Persian perspective, the harem represented an expensive and potentially dangerous concentration of power and influence. The new rulers were uncomfortable with the idea of a secret organization that possessed knowledge that was hidden even from them, and they began implementing changes designed to bring the harem under closer royal control. Some of these changes were relatively minor: requirements for more detailed reporting about the harem's activities, restrictions on the acquisition of certain materials, limitations on contact with foreign practitioners. But others struck at the heart of the harem's traditional autonomy. The Persians insisted on installing their own representatives within the harem to monitor its activities and ensure loyalty to the new regime. These representatives weren't hostile to the harem's practices, but they didn't understand the spiritual principles that govern those practices, and their presence disrupted the careful balance of relationships and responsibilities that had developed over centuries. More seriously, the Persian administration began questioning the necessity of some of the harem's more expensive and elaborate activities. From their perspective, these ceremonies appeared to be wasteful expenditures that didn't produce tangible benefits for the kingdom. The harem's leadership tried to explain the importance of their work, but they faced a fundamental communication problem. The theoretical framework that justified their practices was based on spiritual principles that the Persian administrators didn't share, and concepts that didn't translate well across cultural boundaries. The situation improved somewhat when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE and established the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Greek rulers were more interested in Egyptian culture than the Persians had been, and some of them made genuine efforts to understand and support traditional Egyptian religious practices. But the Ptolemaic period also brought new challenges. Greek intellectual traditions emphasized rational analysis and scientific inquiry, approaches that were sometimes at odds with the more intuitive and mystical methods traditionally used in the harem. Some of the Ptolemaic rulers attempted to reconcile these different approaches by encouraging the harem's practitioners to explain their methods in terms that were compatible with Greek philosophical and scientific concepts. This led to interesting intellectual exchanges, but it also began to change the fundamental character of the harem's practices. When sacred rituals are analyzed and explained in rational terms, they often lose some of their power and meaning. The harem's practices had been developed within a worldview that accepted the reality of spiritual forces and the effectiveness of magical techniques. When these practices were reinterpreted through Greek rational frameworks, they became something fundamentally different. The most serious challenge came with the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE. The Romans were even less sympathetic to Egyptian religious traditions than the Persians had been, and they viewed the harem as a potential source of political opposition and cultural resistance. Roman administrators implemented increasingly strict controls over the harem's activities. They restricted access to certain materials, limited contact with practitioners outside Egypt, and required detailed documentation of all rituals and ceremonies. More fundamentally, the Romans began actively promoting alternative religious and cultural practices that competed with traditional Egyptian traditions. The introduction of Roman religious practices, combined with the growing influence of Christianity, began to erode the cultural foundation that had supported the harem's work for millennia. As traditional Egyptian religious beliefs declined in popularity, it became increasingly difficult to find young women who possessed the spiritual sensitivity and cultural background necessary for training in the forbidden rituals. The careful selection and training processes that had maintained the quality of the harem's practitioners for centuries began to break down. The economic challenges also intensified under Roman rule. The harem's traditional sources of funding were disrupted as Egyptian wealth was increasingly directed toward Roman priorities. The elaborate supply chains that had provided exotic materials for magical work were disrupted by changes in trade patterns and political relationships. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the harem was operating at a fraction of its traditional capacity. Many of the most complex and powerful rituals had been discontinued due to lack of qualified practitioners or necessary materials. The elaborate training programs that had once prepared women for decades of spiritual service were reduced to basic instruction in simplified versions of traditional practices. The rise of Christianity in Egypt presented perhaps the greatest challenge the harem had ever faced. The new religion not only competed with traditional Egyptian spiritual practices, but actively condemned them as demonic or evil. Christian authorities viewed the harem's practices as incompatible with Christian belief and began pressuring Roman administrators and Egyptian leaders to shut down what they saw as centers of pagan superstition. The secrecy that had once protected the harem now made it vulnerable to accusations of practicing dark magic or worshipping evil S. Some members of the harem attempted to adapt their practices to be compatible with Christian belief, reinterpreting their traditional rituals in terms of Christian symbolism and theology. But these adaptations were never fully accepted by Christian authorities, and they fundamentally changed the character of the practices being adapted. The final blow came when Emperor Theodosius I issued edicts in the late 4th century CE that officially banned pagan religious practices throughout the Roman Empire. These edicts specifically targeted secret religious organizations and practices that were conducted away from public oversight. The harem's practitioners faced an impossible choice. They could abandon their traditional practices and accept conversion to Christianity, or they could continue their work in secret with the knowledge that discovery would mean not just death, but persecution as practitioners of forbidden magic. Some chose conversion, taking with them fragments of traditional knowledge that they attempted to preserve within Christian frameworks. Others chose to continue practicing in secret, forming small, hidden groups that maintained simplified versions of traditional rituals. A few of the most dedicated practitioners chose a third option. They left Egypt entirely, traveling to distant lands where they hoped to find communities that would be more receptive to their knowledge and practices. Some went to Nubia, where traditional Egyptian culture persisted longer. Others traveled to India, Persia, or other regions where they believed their spiritual techniques might be valued and preserved. These scattered practitioners carried with them fragments of the harem's ancient knowledge, but they could not maintain the integrated system of practices that had been developed over millennia. Without the elaborate institutional framework that had supported their work in Egypt, they were forced to adapt their practices to very different cultural and spiritual contexts. The last known reference to active practitioners of the harem's forbidden rituals dates to the early 6th century CE, nearly 1,000 years after the decline had begun. By this time, the original system had been so fragmenting and adapted that it bore little resemblance to the elaborate spiritual discipline that had once been practiced in the royal palaces of ancient Egypt. The decline and fall of the harem represents one of history's great losses of human knowledge and spiritual wisdom. The system of practices that had been developed and refined over thousands of years disappeared in the space of a few centuries, taking with it understanding of consciousness, spiritual development, and magical techniques that had represented the pinnacle of ancient achievement in these areas. But the decline also demonstrates the resilience and adaptability of human spiritual wisdom. Although the original system was lost, fragments of its knowledge survived in various forms and influenced the development of other spiritual traditions throughout the world. The story of the harem's decline serves as a reminder of how fragile human cultural achievements can be and how important it is to preserve and transmit traditional knowledge before it is lost forever. It also illustrates the challenges that arise when spiritual traditions encounter radical changes in the cultural and political contexts that originally supported them. The women who had devoted their lives to preserving and practicing the forbidden rituals understood that they were witnessing the end of something extraordinary and irreplaceable. Many of them spent their final years trying to record as much of their knowledge as possible, creating hidden libraries and secret schools that they hoped might preserve at least some of their wisdom for future generations. Whether they succeeded in this effort remains one of history's great mysteries. Rumors persist to this day of hidden texts and secret traditions that preserve fragments of the harem's ancient knowledge, waiting to be rediscovered by those who have the wisdom to understand and use them properly. But regardless of whether any direct continuity exists, the influence of the harem's forbidden rituals can be traced through the development of various mystical and magical traditions throughout the world. The spiritual techniques and theoretical frameworks developed in those ancient chambers continue to influence human understanding of consciousness, healing, and the hidden forces that shape our reality. The women of the Egyptian royal harem understood that they were guardians of something far greater than themselves. They preserved and practiced their forbidden rituals not for personal power or glory, but because they believed this knowledge was essential for human spiritual development and the welfare of civilization itself. Their dedication to this mission, maintained across thousands of years and through countless challenges and dangers, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in the realm of spiritual discipline and the preservation of sacred knowledge. Although their specific practices may have been lost, their example continues to inspire those who seek to understand the deeper mysteries of human consciousness and spiritual potential. The story of the forbidden rituals of the ancient Egyptian royal harem reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievements when they dedicate themselves to purposes that transcend their individual interests. It also reminds us of the importance of preserving and honoring the wisdom of the past, even when we may not fully understand or appreciate its significance. In the end, the greatest mystery surrounding the harem's forbidden rituals may not be what they accomplished or how they were performed, but rather what we have lost through their disappearance, and what we might yet recover if we approach their legacy with the respect, dedication, and spiritual sensitivity that their original practitioners brought to their sacred work. Today, as archaeologists continue to uncover new evidence about ancient Egyptian civilization, and scholars work to decode the remaining fragments of their spiritual knowledge, we are slowly beginning to piece together a more complete picture of what the royal harem represented and why its practices were considered so important. Recent discoveries have revealed the existence of previously unknown chambers beneath several ancient Egyptian palaces, chambers that appear to have been used for ritual purposes and that contain hieroglyphic inscriptions referring to practices that match descriptions found in earlier texts about the harem. These discoveries are providing new insights into the sophisticated understanding of consciousness, healing, and spiritual development that was achieved by the ancient Egyptians. They are also revealing the extent to which the harem's influence extended throughout Egyptian society and beyond Egypt's borders. Modern research in neuroscience, psychology, and consciousness studies is beginning to provide scientific frameworks for understanding some of the phenomena that the harem's practitioners claim to work with. Techniques that were once dismissed as primitive superstition are now being recognized as sophisticated methods for influencing human consciousness and promoting healing and spiritual development. The study of ancient Egyptian spiritual practices is also contributing to contemporary understanding of meditation, altered states of consciousness, and the relationship between mind and body. Researchers are discovering that many of the techniques used in the harem were remarkably similar to practices that are now being developed independently by modern scientists and spiritual teachers. This convergence between ancient wisdom and modern understanding suggests that the women of the Egyptian royal harem may have achieved insights into human consciousness and spiritual potential that we are only now beginning to rediscover. Their forbidden rituals may have preserved knowledge that is not only historically fascinating, but also practically valuable for contemporary spiritual and psychological development. The mystery of the forbidden rituals continues to intrigue and inspire researchers, spiritual seekers, and anyone who is fascinated by the hidden depths of human potential. As we continue to uncover new evidence and develop new understanding, we may eventually be able to piece together a more complete picture of what these remarkable women achieved and how their knowledge might be applied to contemporary challenges and opportunities. But even if we never fully understand the technical details of their practices, the story of the Egyptian royal harem serves as a powerful reminder of what human beings can accomplish when they dedicate themselves to the pursuit of wisdom, the service of something greater than themselves, and the preservation of knowledge that they believe is essential for the welfare of humanity. The women who lived and worked within those mysterious chambers devoted their lives to practices that they believed were crucial for maintaining the spiritual health of their civilization. They accepted extraordinary risks and made tremendous sacrifices in service of this mission, understanding that they were guardians of knowledge that was too important to be lost. Their story reminds us that throughout history, there have been individuals and groups who have taken responsibility for preserving and transmitting the deepest wisdom of their cultures. These guardians of sacred knowledge have often worked in secret, unknown and unappreciated by their contemporaries. But their efforts have preserved insights and understanding that continue to benefit humanity long after their specific cultures and institutions have disappeared. The forbidden rituals of the ancient Egyptian royal harem represent one of the most sophisticated attempts in human history to understand and work with the hidden forces that influence human consciousness and shape the course of events. Although the specific practices may have been lost, the dedication, wisdom, and spiritual achievement of the women who developed and maintained them continue to inspire and instruct us. Their legacy reminds us that the pursuit of spiritual knowledge and the development of human consciousness are among the most important and valuable activities that human beings can engage in. It also reminds us of the importance of approaching such pursuits with the seriousness, dedication, and respect that they deserve. The mystery of the forbidden rituals may never be completely solved, but the questions they raise about human potential, spiritual development, and the preservation of sacred knowledge remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago in the secret chambers of the ancient Egyptian royal harem. As we close this journey into the hidden world of ancient Egypt's most guarded secrets, we're left with more questions than answers. What other mysteries lie buried beneath the sands of Egypt? What other forms of ancient wisdom have been lost to time? And perhaps most intriguingly, what might we discover about ourselves and our own potential if we approached the development of human consciousness with the same dedication and sophistication that these remarkable women brought to their sacred work? The forbidden rituals of the Egyptian royal harem remind us that human history is far richer, more complex, and more mysterious than we often imagine. They challenge us to look beyond the familiar narratives and to consider the possibility that our ancestors achieved levels of understanding and capability that we are only beginning to appreciate. Most importantly, They remind us that the quest for wisdom, the development of human potential, and the service of something greater than ourselves are timeless human endeavors that connect us across the centuries to those who have walked this path before us. The women of the ancient Egyptian royal harem may have lived in a world that seems foreign and distant, but their dedication to these eternal human pursuits makes them our spiritual sisters and teachers across the vast expanse of time. Their story ends not with the final decay of their institutions or the last performance of their rituals, but with the questions they leave us and the inspiration they provide for our own journey toward understanding the deepest mysteries of human consciousness and spiritual potential. In seeking to understand them, we seek to understand ourselves, and in honoring their legacy, we honor the highest aspirations of the human spirit.